Good morning. It is a beautiful sunny morning here in New York City. It's a perfect day to talk solar. Today we have an exciting and innovative approach, which we will be presenting about the intersection between affordable housing and community solar. With coronavirus these days, then it's even more important to be creative to improve housing quality than it ever has been. It is a pleasure to be joined virtually by a really fantastic group of New York City practitioners and experts ranging from property owners, developers, architects, attorneys, policymakers, and more. Before getting started, a little bit more for you and how you're participating. Then everybody's automatically muted, and this is via Zoom, but the only folks whose cameras are going to be active are the presenters. You can ask questions through the Q&A sidebar. We will be collecting questions throughout the presentation and synthesizing them. So after our presentations, there will be about 15 minutes remaining for us to respond to your answers. So let me introduce you to our panel. We have Manish Nair of OYA Solar, myself of Crauderueff Solar, and Lauren Lemack, who's with Services for the Underserved. To run you through our agenda for the morning, we will begin by talking about how we are partnering with Services for the Underserved, and Lauren will begin with her perspective on how community fits into their organization's context. We'll then talk about the opportunities, requirements, and some of the barriers to implementing solar on multifamily affordable housing. And then we will talk more specifically about how community solar in particular is a model which is able to provide a lot of support and can be an excellent match for affordable housing providers. Manish, would you like to jump in with background about OYA?
Yes. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join this webinar. OYA is a developer of community, on-site, and utility scale projects. We'll be celebrating our 11th year in business in a couple of months. And we're very active across the Northeast and specifically in New York. We have over 1,000 megawatts of solar in development and over 100 projects operational or close to operational. We're very excited to be partnered with both Crauderueff and Associates, as well as Services for the Underserved, to help solarize their portfolio of buildings and enable access to renewable energy to the LMI community in New York City.
Thank you. I'm Rob Crauderueff, Crauderueff and Associates. We are affordable solar developers. We specialize in working with multifamily affordable housing in New York City to help provide as much value as possible using creative financing and aggregation tools. We've been around 7 years, have worked across the 5 boroughs. We also work statewide. We have more than 60 housing projects that are operational in development and a pipeline of over 5 megawatts here in the city. So we're really excited to be partnering both with OYA and Services for the Underserved.
All right, and good morning. I'm Lauren Lemack from Services for the Underserved, or SUS. We are a New York City not-for-profit 501c3 social service provider founded in 1978. So we are going on about 42 years old. SUS is one of the largest community-based health and human service providers in New York. We have roughly 2,500 staff, and we serve over 37,000 people each year. We serve individuals and communities who face complex and intersectional issues compounding with poverty and socioeconomic needs, such as people who've lost their homes, people with mental illnesses and addiction challenges, people living with HIV/AIDS, people with autism and other developmental disabilities, survivors of domestic violence, and veterans. The majority of our residents and tenants have experienced homelessness in the years prior to intervention. And SUS develops and operates both supportive housing and housing for low-income individuals and households throughout the city. And on any given night last year, SUS provides housing and shelter to more than 4,500 people. That's a little bit about us. So I'm going to share some information about SUS's portfolio. So our portfolio consists of about 140 buildings that we either own, manage, or lease in New York City. Over 70 of these buildings are owned and managed by SUS, and we lease over 1,000 supportive scatter site apartments throughout Brooklyn, the Bronx, Manhattan, and Queens. We operate an array of residential programs across the city, including 1,500 units of permanent congregate low-income supportive housing, 278 of which are low-income community units. So solar energy and solar infrastructure has been a component of our new development, but our work with Rob's team has been focused on bringing solar to our existing portfolio. Retrofitting existing properties for solar is a lot different than building it into new buildings, and it adds another layer of complexity. So working with Rob and the team at OYA, we were able to identify 18 buildings appropriate for solar system installation. Navigating the renewable energy marketplace has definitely helped us increase our knowledge base at SUS, and this has been really helpful as we look to the future and developing new properties. And we have over 2,000 plus units currently in our development pipeline. So with that, I will pass it back to Rob.
Thank you, Lauren. So to give some background context with respect to how affordable housing and community solar can combine forces. Affordable housing itself has a very advantageous arrangement for developing solar. There's an umbrella corporate entity that manages the subsidiary housing entities, so we can get economies of scale and a lot of efficiencies. There's a lot of real estate expertise that affordable housing organizations have. There's geographic concentration in many cases, which helps to boost the economies of scale. And there are a couple different ways to consider approaching retrofitting a portfolio. One is year 15, during the year 15 refinancing process, where housing owners are undertaking a lot of improvements to begin with. Now, year 15 is happening more slowly right now due to coronavirus and the fact that agencies are moving perhaps more slowly than they typically are. There's also the opportunity with respect to PACT and some of the NYCHA refinancing and restructuring, where there are, again, clusters of buildings to take advantage of in terms of efficiencies of economies of scale. So there are many different opportunities for solar, given the fact that we have really a built-in set of efficiencies and capacity with affordable housing organizations. Now, from the energy side, then is a lot of support from public agencies, and to highlight one to begin is NYSERDA. NYSERDA just was approved for $573 million of new funding dedicated to solar, more than $100 million of that to go to advance and benefit low and moderate income households. Two incentives worth paying particular note of. One is that there's an additional incentive for any solar project that's on affordable housing, which doubles the base incentive essentially as a grant. And another really exciting opportunity is that there's a pre-development grant program for up to $200,000 specifically for providing technical assistance and additional capacity for affordable housing providers to retrofit their portfolios of buildings. We've been able to secure over $400,000 of funding through this program in the past, and believe that now that that program will officially be live in the next couple of weeks, so it's a great time to line up applications, is to be able to provide some additional financial support during the pre-development process for the housing provider and the development team. So to run through the regulatory context, in June of 19, the New York City Climate Mobilization Act provided a slew of requirements, including an emissions cap for many buildings in the city. As a part of that package was Local Law 92, which came into effect in November of 2014, which provides HPD with 5 years to essentially figure out how to require solar on all roofs and all new roofs on affordable housing. And solar has to be assessed right now for any new roof that receives HPD funding. And if HPD deems it cost effective, then the solar must be implemented. So there's some current policy triggers for solarizing affordable housing right now. As we discussed, there's some additional significant additional grant funding that came out this year. The 5-year window is relevant, not just because building code comes into effect in 5 years that says all new roofs on multifamily affordable housing have to incorporate solar, but the substantial NYSERDA funding is scheduled to run out by 2025, and NYSERDA does not expect to see additional funding to help to support solar thereafter. There are a number of barriers to solarizing affordable housing rooftops. Important to understand them before talking about specifically how to overcome them. Upfront cost is a clear one. There's a high upfront cost for solar. It's complex to secure debt. And not just in terms of debt, but there's a tax equity question, not unlike affordable housing itself that seeks to take advantage of low-income housing tax credits. There's a substantial solar investment tax credit, which is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to access to retrofit relatively modest portfolios of buildings. So being able to capture and take advantage of a tax appetite of the federal solar income tax credit is a challenge for existing building portfolios. In-house capacity is a challenge. There's limited time and expertise of affordable housing providers. Their primary business is developing and managing housing. And so there's only so much time and effort that makes sense to put into a solar project. And we need to be cognizant of that. Similarly, in terms of operation and maintenance, to make sure the systems are functioning as they're supposed to, and that improvements are made as they're supposed to make sure the system's functioning properly. Lastly, historically speaking, there hasn't been an opportunity for tenants to directly benefit from a solar project. And fortunately, community solar provides an opportunity to extend the economic benefits of solar to tenants, but that's not been an option in the past. So I will now hand the baton to Manish, who will talk about community solar.
Thanks, Rob. So what is community solar? Community solar is a means to build a solar project in one location, which is an optimal location, and then allow the owner of the solar system to then sell shares of the electricity to subscribers, and those subscribers would receive that share of electricity based on their annual consumption of electricity from their existing utility provider. And if we break this down into three simple steps, in step one, and using the work we've done with SUS, we would install solar across their portfolio of buildings, and they would receive value in two ways. The first is that they would have the opportunity to be one of the subscribers and serve as an anchor tenant, if we want to call it that, for the electricity, and they would earn a bill credit, which is calculated from something called the VEDR value stack, which is simply put a method to calculate the value of that solar electricity that's being generated on the roof. And the second stream of revenue or benefit that SUS receives is an annual lease payment for the benefit of allowing us to put the solar on the roof, as well as an upfront payment to help facilitate the project management work that's required to get the project built and financed on the roof. And then how does it work on an ongoing basis? So the first utility bill that SUS would receive for a particular building would continue to be the same as it was before solar. The only difference would be that they would see a line item at the bottom of the bill, which would show the VEDR bill credit. And that bill credit would be related to how much energy our system produced on the roof, and not tied to the consumption or the pricing of the energy from the existing utility bill. And in this example, if their energy costs for that month happen to be $1,000, the bill credit would be, in our example, $500, which would be how much generation we produce on the roof times the credit, and the net bill owing by SUS to the utility company would be $500. And then step 3, SUS would receive a bill from us for 90% of that value. And that 90% covers, our construction costs, our financing costs, and our ongoing operation and maintenance costs. What this means is that there's no money payable by SUS throughout the process, from the initial letter of intent all the way through to construction, and of course on an ongoing basis during operation. And in return, SUS gets to keep 10% of that bill credit. And so in this example, if the bill credit was $500, they retain $50 a month, or in this particular month, of savings. And how does community solar differ than net metering? Because some of you on the webinar may be familiar with a traditional net metering system where you install solar on your roof, it's behind your utility meter, and of course you can also save money. So I think the biggest difference is in the value of the credit, which in the case of the VEDR bill credit in New York City can range anywhere from 21 to 29 cents a kilowatt hour, versus your energy only cost in a net metering scenario of 9 to 11 cents. So a lot more additional value there. Secondly, of course, and very relevant to this audience, we have the ability to support the benefit to share the benefit with the tenant community of the housing provider, which is not an option when we're talking about net metering. And thirdly, and probably most importantly, the bill credit is a guaranteed savings. OYA, in this instance, takes the risk of the credit fluctuating, but each subscriber has the benefit of a guaranteed savings. And that's not the case with typical net metering. And two additional positive benefits with going with community solar. One is this creates a lot more value for the utility, because now the energy is being put in front of your utility meter, and that allows the utility to better plan capacity and resources because they can now see how much generation is coming on the grid, and that's a positive benefit, which is partly the reason why the value of the meter credit is so high compared to typical energy costs. Secondly, we have the ability on certain buildings, particularly in New York City, to add batteries to the solar system, which not only increases the value of the credit to each subscriber of the power, it also increases the total amount of power generated, and then in turn creates overall increases of value for everybody. So to summarize, the opportunity for community solar, for affordable housing providers and community solar is really twofold. One, the lease payments create a steady revenue stream for the housing provider for otherwise unused real estate, and helps offset the upfront project management costs to help create some support within the organization to move forward with the process. Additionally, there's a revenue stream that allows the housing provider as well as tenants within the organization to save money from day one on their utility bills, which can be used, of course, for other for other daily or month-to-month needs of those individuals and families. So the impact, we feel, is broad, across the community and in several ways. Not only are we building capacity and creating a mechanism to build capacity within the team, but we're providing social equity in the sense that, we're now decoupling, the ability and the access to clean energy with actually being able to make the choice. Now, everyone in New York City, and our hope is that everyone in New York City, once we're able to really penetrate the affordable housing community, we can enable clean energy access to everyone in the community, not just those people that have high credit scores or the ability to finance solar systems on their homes or on their commercial buildings. This really allows those that typically wouldn't have the opportunity to have access to clean energy, the ability to receive it. And then ultimately, we hope that this creates more additionality in the market and ultimately helps reduce the impacts of climate change and traditional fossil fuel generation, within the community itself. And an overview of the structure, just to help illustrate the point. OYA in this instance would own the solar project on the roof, and there would be two specific agreements. One would be with the housing entity itself that owns the property, and that would be a lease agreement, which would include a one-time upfront payment, which we would equate to a project management payment or fee, to help offset the cost of spending the time and effort to get the project to the finish line. And then an additional annual lease payment to the property entity for a period of 25 to 35 years. The second agreement would be the actual subscription agreement, which would be the mechanism to purchase each subscriber's share of the power. And a typical anchor customer would be a larger volume user, and in this instance, the housing entity itself, perhaps the common areas or other lighting load around the building itself. They could subscribe for up to 40% of the capacity of the solar system's generation. And then each individual tenant, and there's no limit on how many individual tenants there could be, which we call mass market residential subscribers, could be anywhere from 60% all the way up to 100% of the capacity, depending on the particular project. And they would they would all save a guaranteed 10% of the meter bill credit every month. And as an example, we thought it was important to share a typical timeline with you. And using SUS as an example, we typically would expect a portfolio of this size, 18 to 20 projects, to take approximately 15 months to get from the signed LOI stage, where we would then conduct due diligence on each individual site, which we'll talk about shortly, negotiate the lease agreement and the main subscription agreement with the housing entity itself, and then move on to the utility interconnection process, which can sometimes take 3 to 4 months and sometimes can be faster. And then work with the relevant agencies on permitting, whether that's the DOB or FDNY, and there may be others on a particular project. That can take sometimes 3 to 6 months. And on a portfolio, on a portfolio of this size of approximately 400 kilowatts, we would expect the construction to take, on average, 3 to 6 months. All the while, in parallel, once we've completed our due diligence, OYA on the back end will structure all the financing in order to make the project happen. And that will line up through the construction phase. And then once we're in commercial operation, we expect that project to have a useful life, in some instances, all the way up to 40 years. Okay, now I'll turn it back to Lauren.
Okay. So one major and extremely important impact of the solar panel installations, and one of our main incentives, is the reduction in energy costs for both SUS and our residents. So for tenants who are responsible for their own electricity bills, the cost reduction in the electricity bill savings will have a positive impact on their quality of life. And in buildings where SUS covers all the electricity costs, a reduction in energy and operational costs allows us to spend savings on other operational and program needs, passing the savings benefits onto the individuals and the families we serve. We especially chose this particular model where OYA leases our roof space because it's a low risk, low cost process that either directly or indirectly benefits our tenants in our communities. There have been a few upfront costs for us, as Manish mentioned. Early in the process, after we first engaged with Rob and his team, we pursued a Section 4 capacity building grant through Enterprise to help us cover the legal fees that have come up along the way. And this has mostly helped us cover the cost of having attorneys review the lease agreements. There's also been a fair amount of staff time put into the process so far. We have a pretty sizable portfolio, so we had to gather information so that the team could complete the feasibility analysis to see which buildings were a good fit for community solar. But as I said before, SUS views it as a long-term investment for our clients and our communities, and they are the main focus of our team and our organization. So all in all, we looked at this as a long-term investment for both SUS's housing portfolio and also our clients, our consumers, and the communities that we serve. So I will turn it back to Rob, who will go into a little bit more detail.
So as Lauren was saying, then the solar can provide a long-term opportunity for achieving long-term benefits for housing providers, and we're very cognizant of the staffing requirements and limitations of affordable housing organizations. Provide quite a bit of support along the way. We have boilerplate documents for investors and lenders and internal approval, for example. And as I mentioned earlier, there is an opportunity to leverage the extension of the New York Sun grant program, which I mentioned earlier, to really bolster the capacity of an affordable housing organization as you're undertaking the retrofitting of your portfolio. So in terms of what that looks like on a day-to-day basis, then the first step, we work with Lauren's team in terms of conducting a fact-based assessment of what are the existing conditions. We analyze utility bills, did initial desktop review of the sites, then we followed up with site visits to help to confirm the scope of the project, understand, do an initial visual understanding of the roof, and if there are any obstructions on the roof, take a look at the electrical rooms and consider some practical issues in terms of connection. During once the lease agreement is in place, then a full engineering and technical analysis is conducted, which will really make sure that which will essentially develop the construction documentation for the project. Lastly, there is in terms of the scope that we have in place, we're looking at 390 kilowatts across 18 different properties, looking at construction later toward the end of this year. It's, as Manish mentioned, it's a third-party financed approach, so there's no out-of-pocket cost for SUS other than their legal. It's a one-time project management payment along with the lease payments and the 10% utility bill credits to properties and the tenants. So there are broad-based benefits and savings across the board. With that, I would like to turn it over to Manish for the last word.
Oh, there we go. Sorry about that, I was on mute. Thank you. Again, we think that the approach that we've taken to trying to leave some of the upfront burden of various housing provider organizations entering into or taking the time to investigate the viability of solar on the roof makes a lot of sense. We believe that our approach of providing equal opportunity to both the housing entity as well as the tenant, the LMI tenants and broader community is an equitable one that really allows everyone to both have the opportunity and receive the benefit of access to clean energy. And from our perspective, it's a mission-focused goal in the sense that we want to see, we want the effects of, or the benefits of fighting climate change to really flow into these communities, so that they also can receive the benefit. And I think with that, I'd like to thank you all for taking the opportunity to, or for allowing us the opportunity to share this approach with you and the work we've done with FUS. And I think, Rob, it might make sense to address some of the questions. I think we had one come in. This question came from Gaythree. You are correct. There may be some instances in which the total generation from the building is not enough to meet the entire demands of the tenants in the building. So there are a few instances, and there are a few opportunities in that instance. One could be that all the available generation is equally divided to each tenant, or conversely, there could be another approach in which certain tenants, because certain tenants may not want access for any number of reasons, they may not sign up. So the second scenario would be that on a first come first served basis, or maybe it's there could be any number of ways in which you could identify who would have the benefit of receiving the energy and the savings. There was another question. What is the hit ratio of a site where it makes sense to install solar? I think the general hit ratio is high. I think we can benefit from, given the relatively smaller size of systems on individual roofs in this market segment. We typically wouldn't expect very high interconnection costs with the local utility or complex requirements. Generally, it's a pretty streamlined process. Really, what it comes down to is not only the viability of the solar array, to produce energy on the site, but also the structural integrity of the roof to support the array, and the quality of the roofing system and any issues that may result. So if we can resolve those issues up front, then we typically would expect a very high proportion of sites to work with solar. The question really comes down to the size of the array.
Can you repeat the questions out loud, please, Manish, for everybody?
Sure. That last question was, what is the hit ratio of a site where it makes sense to install solar?
Got it.
We have an additional question. Can you discuss more about the third-party financing, and can PACE finance this? So the third-party financing structure that we would typically use would be a combination of tax equity from a tax equity investor that we would source, and we have relationships in the market with our broader portfolio. And they would pretty typically provide around a third of the capital. Another third of the capital would come from our long-term debt financing relationships, and the remaining third would come from OYA. And Rob, maybe you could speak a little bit more about PACE, if you have any specific experience in New York City.
Yeah, so PACE, which is set to come online in the next, however soon. They said that earlier this year, but with coronavirus, it was set back a bit. The concept of PACE is it's property assessed clean energy. So that a property owner would finance a building improvement for energy efficiency purposes, in part using a debt, which is then paid back on the property tax bill. Now, the short answer is no, it would not be financed against PACE. And the reason for that is that this third-party financing arrangement is completely off balance sheet and completely off any, there are no financial implications for an organization in terms of taxation, other than the New York City property tax abatement, a benefit that we didn't speak about. If there's property tax liability that qualifies for the property tax abatement, then that's a benefit that can be stacked on, and that stays with the property, right? So no to PACE, yes to property tax abatement in the event that there's a qualifying project, which is occasional. It's not never the case with affordable housing, but of course it is more occasional given the multitude of tax abatements which affordable housing generally takes advantage of. Next question, Manish, if you can run us through. Oh, you need to unmute. I got you. Oh, go for it.
Oh, there we go. Thanks. The next question was, can you talk a little bit more about adding battery storage? Yes. So the short answer is, where we have the ability to add battery storage, and this is less so in New York City. This is less so an issue from OYA's perspective, and more so an issue in working through the requirements from FDNY and their siting concerns. But in the cases where we're able to meet the requirements, battery storage allows us to store any excess power created by the solar panels in times of higher sun irradiance. And typically when we have higher sun irradiance, we don't fully have the ability to inject all of that power on the grid. And so adding the batteries allows us to store the excess capacity we generate, but are unable to push onto the grid at that time and inject it onto the grid later. And sometimes that allows us to achieve or receive a higher bill credit, depending on time of use pricing. But in all instances, it allows us to actually put more power on the grid and receive more bill credits for the subscribers. We have another question. How soon will permits and interconnection approval be ready to begin installation? Complicated question. That's pretty site specific, but I think generally we expect the interconnection and permitting process to take approximately 6 months. And then from that point, we would schedule construction around weather.
It greatly varies by site. Con Ed is pretty quick in terms of a turnaround for a small site, but where you have more complicated issues on site, then there's much more coordination required. For example, if there's older electrical systems, then Con Ed may require a site visit so that they can understand exactly what the existing conditions are and what's necessary to interconnect to the grid. So it will vary by building and by portfolio.
Right. An additional question, you mentioned tenants are guaranteed up to 10% of the bill credit toward their utility bill. How are tenants able to attain a greater share of the output solar value and thus a greater monthly bill credit? Typically, we find that 10% is generally where the program pencils. There may be a particular instance in where there's an opportunity for a particular subscriber portfolio to share more, but we typically haven't seen that. Usually, we like to focus on enabling the solar upfront. And that typically requires more capital allocated to the solar system or improvements that we may need to make. So I think the 10% is a general rule of thumb that we like to follow. The last question here. No, sorry, two more questions. How do the building residents participate in the program? So this is something I can generally tell you, and maybe Rob and Lauren, you'd like to chime in, but we would work with the housing provider to help provide access to the tenants and create a marketing program, and that form may vary from organization to organization or even building to building. But generally, we would want to work with the housing provider. We would basically let the provider know this is how much capacity is available and what's the best way for us to market this to the tenant, to the tenants. I don't know, Lauren or Rob, if you want to jump in.
So I'll jump in quickly, and then Lauren, you can jump in. In general, affordable housing providers have very long-standing relationships and frequently very close relationships with their tenants. And so they're really the best situated to help to enroll their tenants who may require education. Trust is a very important aspect of understanding that this is a legitimate program, that the savings are real. And we work directly with SUS in terms of, and any housing provider in terms of the education and training of staff and being present along with them where it's helpful. So really, it's our general approach and belief that the social capital, the relationships and trust that housing providers have is really essential to being able to sign up their tenants for the projects. Lauren, would you like to add to that?
I think you pretty much covered it. We haven't really gotten to the point of tenant outreach yet, but we have been planning it. We've been working on a one-pager of information that we'd like to present to them, but that's our plan so far. So we'll be working with program staff to ensure that the tenants know exactly what this is, how it works, how it benefits them, and how to participate if they would like to participate, and leave it up to them.
Another question, since the building is still connected to the grid, will the battery storage not provide power during outages? It is technically possible. I would have to confirm with our engineers, but we typically don't foresee a scenario in this instance at the moment where we would allow the inverters, the batteries to inject power when there wasn't a signal from the grid. That is something that we've been discussing, and I think that there's some more, technically it is possible and very possible and used every day. I think in this scenario with Con Ed, we haven't yet gotten to that point where we believe they would allow us to do that. But it is possible, and the systems that we're building and to change it to that structure would be a very nominal, from a resource perspective, that the systems would be enabled to do that. It would just be something that we would have to convert it to in the future. Does the distance between buildings within a portfolio affect the efficiency of the system or the complexity of coordinating the various arrays? Good question. The answer is no. Each building array operates on its own and is its own system and connected to the grid individually. So the economies of scale for us, as Rob mentioned, is really on the geographic proximity to allow our construction crews to be efficient, well, through the whole process, engineering, development, construction. It just, we're working in one geographic area, so we get the benefits of not having to take the equipment, back to the yard. What percentage of the housing project electricity consumption is met by the solar array burst from the utility grid? That is hard to answer. It's really a function of how many units are in the building and the actual footprint of the rooftop array. Rob, would you have any better way? I mean, it could be as low as 10% and as high as 50%. It really just depends.
Yeah, it does depend in terms of the particular building, how efficient the building is, the layout. If you have a 4-story, 200-unit building, then you're going to be generating a lot of energy relative to the number of units. If you have a large flat roof with not a whole lot of obstructions, whereas if you have an 8-story building with a 5,000 square foot footprint, then the amount of solar that can be generated compared to the common area cost is going to be a lot lower. So it really depends on the particularities of a given site.
Yeah. And that was the last question that we have in the Q&A. Maybe we can give folks another 20 seconds. If you have any final questions, please ask them now. looks like we're good.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us, and we look forward to continuing the conversation in a more one-on-one setting with those of you who are interested at a later point in time.
Oh, we do have one more question.
Okay. Jump the gun.
Hello, is there an energy savings education aspect to these projects for both tenants and property owners? Best practices for saving energy, etc. Really great question. We do have the ability to provide educational tools to the tenants. It would be similar to things that we've done in the past with schools. And in terms of, but that would be related specifically to the solar array, and if we couple it with storage, then solar plus storage. But in terms of a broader energy savings education, I'm sure, Rob, you've had a ton of experience, in building efficiency and energy efficiency in general. So maybe I would hand that over to you.
Sure. Well, a lot of what we'll do is to coordinate with other efficiency providers. So, for example, if there's an integrated physical needs assessment, then we'll coordinate with their efforts or other efficiency providers. And then we can come in and work hand in hand with an energy efficiency team. I mean, our scope is limited to solar, which we found can be an efficient approach as a single team and a partnership. But when it's ideal to be able to have the opportunity to partner with other energy efficiency experts and have this be part of a broader conversation, because of course, there's more than just solar that needs to happen to make a building be as efficient as possible.
Yeah. One additional question. Can you please re-summarize the two agreements between you and the building owners, and do you have to get consents from LPs and first lien holders, mortgages, and how has your experience been in that regard? Yeah, so the two agreements, the relevant agreement in terms of consent would be the lease agreement itself, because the lease agreement would give us access to the property, and there are provisions for our lenders in those lease agreements to be comfortable when we do structure the agreements. So there would be consents, and typically SNDAs would be required from any first lien holders on the property. And our experience generally has been pretty good. That, just generally across the broad range of projects, whether they're ground mounted or mounted on buildings or in parking lots, the experience in terms of going to the lenders or any first lien holders has generally been positive. It takes a little bit of time, but we typically don't see a lot of pushback there. The second agreement is a subscription agreement, and that's simply an agreement to purchase the power on a monthly basis over a defined period of time, and that's directly with the entity itself. So that would probably flow through any board approvals required. That would be, I think, subject to each entity's operating agreements and what consents would be required to enter into a contract like that. Rob, do you have any more color you'd like to add? And maybe Lauren.
Yeah, I mean, I would say we're aware that investor and lender approval is part of the process for affordable housing, and we've navigated that for various projects that we've worked on in the past. So it's a part of the process with affordable housing, like other property owners, and there are commitments that need to be taken care of during the lease negotiation process. So that's something that we, is part of the first phase of the project as we're doing the balance of due diligence. Lauren, do you want to add anything?
I think you both covered it.
Thank you guys for your time. Again, if you have any more additional questions or would like us to take a look at your buildings, please feel free to reach out to Rob or myself anytime. We'd be more than happy to discuss, and thank you guys for your time on this webinar today. We hope you all found it useful and your gears are turning.
Thank you.
And thanks, Rob, and thanks, Lauren, for joining as well. Great.
Thank you.
Have a good morning, everybody.
Thank you, guys. Take care.